Karachi Literary Festival on February 10th, then Lahore Literary Festival, and so on. I spent 1 year, like Khurram was a Pakistan scholar, I was a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a non-partisan, non-political think tank. And the reason why I chose Woodrow Wilson was that we have great access to Library of Congress. And it is a repository of post-partition economic history which you cannot find anywhere else. So the question which I wanted to explore in this book was that between 1950 and 1990, Pakistan went through 6 major shocks, and you all know the uprooting of the population, rehabilitation of 8 million people in a new country which had no administrative infrastructure, which had no physical infrastructure, which was 1/4 of the total population. Then you had the Indo-Pakistan War, followed by the 71 separation of the country, then Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's major shift in the economic policies of nationalization, and then followed by the Afghan War. So this was a very tumultuous period in Pakistan's history. And because a lot of youngsters present here, they don't realize that despite these difficulties and challenges, Pakistan was among the top 10 performing countries in the world. Its economic growth between 1950 to 1990 was 6.5% per annum, and very few countries actually excelled at. By comparison, India's growth rate was 3% per annum. So we were way ahead of India, even China, Vietnam. Those big players today were nowhere to be seen in comparison to Pakistan. And then from 1990 to 2015, where my study terminates, we became a laggard. We fell behind not only India, but Bangladesh, which was nowhere to be seen in 1990. Vietnam had much lower exports even in 1990s. Last year they reached $190 billion of exports. And we went down from 25 billion to 21 billion in 4 or 5 years' time. Our social indicators do not look good. Our energy shortages are known to all of you. Our literacy rate, our health indicators, I don't have to go into that. So the question I wanted to explore in this study of mine, what were the differentiating points between the first period and the second period? Why did we actually do so badly in this period, and why did we do so good in the first period? Now, if you look at economic literature about Pakistan, and I will, because of the timing and I want to have more interactive dialogue, I want to say there are 5 major hypotheses about the difference in the later period and the first. The most common argument which I have seen is that Pakistan is now a fragile, failing, and failed state with a large expanding arsenal of nuclear weapons, encircled by extremist Islamic elements, safe haven for nurturing and training terrorists who pose a threat to other countries. So Pakistan, in other words, is an ungovernable state. And because of this, your economic drift can be explained by the fact that economic agents both domestic and international, are reluctant to undertake any new investments under this kind of environment. This hypothesis may be partially valid, but let me take you as to where the drift started. In 1990, there was no terrorism in Pakistan. It started after 2001, 2002, after we joined the war against terror. But between 1990 to 2000, the average growth rate had already come down from 6.5% in the 1980s to 4%. Investment ratios, export growth, social indicators all took a dip. Poverty that was declining actually worsened by the late 1990s. On the contrary, on the 2002-2008 period, that was a period of violence and terror activities, including assassination attempts on the sitting president and the prime minister. We reached a remarkable growth rate of 6 to 7% over this period of time. Investment GDP ratio peaked to 23%, and foreign direct investment reached up to $5 billion. In 2008-2013, again, we had a decline, but picking up from 2014 onwards, our growth rate has improved and is on upward trend. So this argument doesn't hold because there has been no correlation between terrorism and economic performance. After this, the most popular hypothesis is now taken for granted, not only by the scholars, but by every one of us present here, is that this is the availability of generous foreign assistance, which has been the main determinant of Pakistan's economic success or failure, and Pakistan's fortunes have vacillated with the ebb and rise of the flows from external donors. This is called the aid dependence hypothesis. And I will distinguish between the two variants of this hypothesis. The first is that the three periods where economic growth really spurted, which is 60s, 80s, and early 2000s, can be ascribed to the heavy infusion of money into this country from outsiders. And that's why there was a turnaround in Pakistan's economy. And the second variation is that Pakistan has always been heavily dependent on large military and economic assistance that gets a boost during the military period, and therefore the growth performance is better. Now I have a table which shows the comparison between the 60s and the 70s, 80s and 90s military democratic regimes, and 2008 and 2009-2014, alternate between military and democratic regimes, and high growth and low growth. The annual average capital flows from outside was 385 million in 1960s, 588 in 1970s, 870 million in 80s, 1110 between 1990s and the democratic regime, 1653 between 2000 to 2008, and 2,851 million in 2009 to 14. So there is no difference between the high growth military regimes and the lower regimes. And if you look at the net official development assistance, it was the highest in 1960-68, 7.4, and then it has been declining, and 2008 to 14 it was 1.3. So those Pakistanis who feel very much insecure that we depend on the US and we depend on the IMF and we depend on the World Bank should take pride that more than 98% of your own GDP is generated by the efforts of people in this country or those who are working outside Pakistanis. So this factor or hypothesis also does not bear any truth. Then we come to the third factor, which is, the external circumstances economically have been pretty bad for Pakistan. And therefore, our exports are declining because the external demand for our exports is not the same. Ladies and gentlemen, developing countries have never done so well as between 1990 to 2008, before the global financial crisis. And there's a whole book by Steve Redlett called Great Search. And he shows that the per capita income in developing countries increased by more than 70% between 1995 and 2013. The number of poor people has gone down from 2 billion to 897 million. And only 13% of the people in the world, in the developing world, are now below the poverty line. The share of emerging market countries in the world export has almost doubled from 24% to 41%, and therefore there is a resentment against the developing countries in the US, Europe, and Japan. And the social indicators like life expectancy, infant mortality, maternal mortality, net enrollment ratios, year of schooling have all gone up. So India has quadrupled its share in the international market. Bangladesh has tripled it, and we have actually gone down. So this hypothesis that external conditions have led us to our decline is also not true. The fourth one is more interesting. It's called the Garrison State Syndrome, which says that Pakistan has been obsessed right from the beginning with confronting a much larger arch-rival India since its formation, and therefore it had to allocate a much larger proportion of its resources to defense expenditure and to preserve and expend the corporate interests of the military. Therefore, the neglect of education, health, human development, and diversion of resources to meet the demands of defense and nuclear capability and other security-related expenditures has led to the present economic and social conditions. This is very popular again. Ladies and gentlemen, let me again go to the data. And these tables are all in my book. Between 1950 to 1990, the period where I told you that we were growing by 6.5%, the annual growth rate of defense expenditure was around 6% per annum. Between 1990 to 2015, the annual growth of defense expenditure was only 3%. So when the economy was growing, defense expenditure was also growing. And when the economy is down, the defense expenditure was also down. So in 1960, 28% of Pakistan's expenditure was spent on defense and only 6.2% on education and health. Remember that. By 1990, we were still spending 26% on defense and only 12.7% on education and health. The same number today is, in 2015, we are spending 13% of our expenditure, total expenditure, on defense, and 14.8% on education and health. So the period where education and health expenditure is increasing and defense spending is declining, we are having a poor economic growth rate. So that hypothesis of garrison state also doesn't hold true. And finally, there is this whole question of the what they call as the defense corporate interests. Now, the whole Army Welfare Foundation, Shaheen, Baria, Fauji Foundation has enterprises whose market cap is only 4.5% of the Karachi Stock Exchange. Now it's Pakistan Stock Exchange. So it's not a big player as compared to the rest of the groups. There are 11 groups which are much more powerful than the entire holdings of these corporate interests. So what is then the reason why Pakistan is not doing so well? And that is what. So I start by looking at the international empirical and theoretical literature. The first indication came in when I looked at a study done by IMF in which they found that governance has a statistically significant impact on GDP per capita across 93 countries, and governance explains 75% of the cross-country variations in the incomes of the poorest quintile. In other words, if you have good governance, then your GDP growth goes up, and even the poor benefit from this growth. Then there was a study which was done by Asian Development Bank, only for Asian countries, in 2010. And it shows that developing Asian economies which had government effectiveness, regulatory quality, and the rule of law, they grew faster on average during 1998-2008 than those whose economies were below the average. The authors concluded that good governance is associated with both a higher level of per capita GDP as well as higher rate of GDP growth. And I quote many examples which you don't bother about because this is only for scholars. For your purpose, I would only come to the Pakistan study, which was done at the Pakistan Institute for Development Economics by Rashida Haq and Uzma Zia, who looked at 96 to 2005 period and looked at the linkage between good governance and pro-poor growth. And they came to the conclusion that governance indicators have low scores and rank at the lowest possible percentile as compared to the other countries. So their study shows a strong link between governance indicators and pro-poor growth. So this is the gorilla in the room, which is the good governance. Now, good governance is a very abstract and a very broad-based term, and there's no agreement on what its definition is. In case of Pakistan, my first book, which was the Pakistan, the Economic Elite State, provides the explanation for the decline in the 1990-2015 period. The hypothesis is that a narrow elite consisting of people like you and me, which is only 1 to 2% of our population, has used both the state and the markets for their own political power and self-enrichment to the neglect of the majority of the population, particularly the poor and the less privileged community. And market is good at efficient allocation of resources. But if you have collusion, if you have connivance, the markets are rigged, there is no level playing field, there is no competition, there are favoritism in allocation of resources by the state, the elite has rigged the market for their favor. So there is no efficiency, so you lose efficiency. And the state is very good in distributing the gains of growth among the larger population through its taxation policy, through its expenditure policy. So it gets taxes from the rich and distributes it to the poor in the form of the social safety transfers, expenditures in the rural areas and the infrastructure. Here, the rich don't pay taxes, and the poor have to pay the taxes through indirect taxation. 76% of Pakistan taxation is indirect, which is highly regressive. So every poor Pakistani who even has a mobile phone has to pay taxes, whether he is within the income limit or not. So the state is not doing its function. So this is the reason why the governance has actually declined. You have a tap of water, which is the policies, and you have a pipe, which are the institutions of governance. And here are the people of Pakistan who get the water from the big reservoir for their own needs. So if the pipe is leaking through corruption, through other means, or through hijacking, or it is clogged, it is not being taken care of, like our irrigation system, which is one of the finest in the world, but we have 50% losses. We have electricity where we have 20 to 25% transmission and distribution losses. We have gas, which used to be only 4% losses, it's now gone up to 14% losses. You have state enterprises which are incurring losses of 400 to 500 billion rupees. So if you have these kind of elements, here, when the people are getting, they get only a little bit of trickle of water. So the policies may be good, but institutions which deliver these policies to the people of Pakistan are not benefiting from it. And that's why the economic growth is declining. I then go into the World Governance Indicators, Global Competitiveness Reports, Human Development Index, Economic Freedom Index, Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, International Country Risk Guide, UNESCO, and they all show these indicators to be declining. So what is the solution if the institutions are not functioning? In 2006, we submitted a report for the reform of the entire administrative service structure of Pakistan. But that report has not been accepted because it takes away the political patronage from the hands of the politicians or whosoever power may be, because it is based on certain principles of appointment by merit for the right person for the right job, compensation, promotions, basis on performance, accountability for results, giving them autonomy, don't remove them at whims. That has not been accepted. So you can either give up or you go to a second order condition, which is that we identify some key institutions which are critical for accountability, growth, equity, and security of Pakistan. And you say these 25 institutions, if you can correct them and reform them and restructure them, and I am proud to say that we have a working example of these reforms at a microcosm level at the State Bank of Pakistan. You can actually have a positive demonstration effect and spillover effect. Give you one example. I have run out of my time. If you have all the appointments made by an independent, competent public service commission who selects the right person for the right job, what will happen? That person will bring in his own team of the right people, and this will all go throughout the organization. The organization will turn around. So you do this for Auditor General of Pakistan, you do this for the Federal Board of Revenue, you do this for the security, lower judiciary, and you will see the results. Not immediately, but at least over a period of time. And Pakistan's middle class is now very demanding. It's urbanized, it is linked with the international, media. It is going to be very demanding. And if you don't deliver by improving your institutions, you'll be thrown out in the next elections, because the rural constituencies are becoming much, much smaller compared to the urban. And urban middle class is rising. And they will demand performance and good governance through institutions. So that's the theme of my humble contribution in the service of improving Pakistan's economy. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, working, yes. Okay, many thanks for that, Dr. Ishrat, and thanks also for largely staying within time on this whole thing. A big question before me is where to start. Because we've got a rather vast and expansive presentation before us that has touched on many things. But the first time that I met Dr. Ishrat, and I'm sure you might remember, was in a hotel not far from here. We had a very long and testy interview, which then also went on the air. So let me challenge you this time as well. And let's start with this. Somebody might say that your approach is rather old-fashioned. When I came, I was under the impression we are going to be talking about governability, which I take to mean to what extent can the state command the obedience and the respect of its citizenry, and to what extent can its institutions find legitimacy in the hearts and minds of its own people. But instead you spoke about growth. You collapsed governability and growth together. And that's how it used to be. I remember at one point in time in the 50s and the 60s, if you went to study development economics in a premium institution, it was understood at that point in time that the path to development leads through, and there are many other views as well. Yet you continue to see growth as the path to governability.
I very humbly disagree, because this is the current literature that in order to reach out to the majority of the population, to share prosperity, the word today is not growth. The word today is shared prosperity. That you have lifted, even in Pakistan, you have lifted a lot of people out of poverty. But your middle 40% is still deprived of basic needs: education, health, law and order, security, drinking water, sanitation. And governance is the way to strengthen those institutions which are going to deliver these goods and services for promoting shared prosperity. What is governance all about? It's not an abstract term. It is for a certain purpose. And in my vocabulary, it's not 50s or 60s. It is the governance should be able to spread the benefits of prosperity to a larger segment. Resources disproportionate to their own status.
Okay. But the exact same state of affairs came to obtain in the time period that you are holding up as an example for us in the 1950s and 60s. And that regime, I've often seen economists hark back to that regime and tell us that there is a lot to learn from it. But one thing that is always left out of that telling of the tale is that that regime ended in tears. And it ended in tears precisely because of the vast disparities in income distribution, in opportunities, in regional disparities that it was built upon.
I'm afraid I again have a different view. I served as a young civil servant in places like Patwakali, then I became Deputy Commissioner Chittagong and Deputy Secretary Home. I do not think that East Pakistan did not benefit from what was happening in the 1960s. There were immense benefits. But the political equation where a military autocrat takes over, concentrates in a very vibrant and democratically inclined, province was the main focus. And let me also submit to you that a country which did not have a single industry, you must have a strategy whereby those entrepreneurs who are able to accumulate wealth and invest in them, let them become rich because they are creating your industrial infrastructure. But as it evolves over time, then the concentration of wealth has to be taken care of by the state by redistributing the benefits.
This is the doctrine of functional inequality that Mehboob Ulhaq talked about in 1962, that Gustav Papanek talked about in 1968. And yet you disagree with me that this is that you're taking an old-fashioned approach.
His empirical evidence was totally distorted. I have great regard for Mr. Mehboob Ulhaq, and he provided ammunition to Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who destroyed the edifice of our industry, of our commerce, of our educational institutions, based on that 22 family slogan. And I personally do not buy that particular argument.
We've got a lot to cover, and I should open it up, so let's move along, rather than get bogged down in one debate. Let's take on the 5 major hypotheses and what you said about them one by one in rapid fire. Okay? You said, for instance, in hypothesis number 1, that where people argue Pakistan is a fragile, failing state with nuclear weapons and militants, and it's presented as this. And, there you and I agree, I have some problems with that presentation of the country too. But nevertheless, you said in 1990 there was no terrorism in Pakistan. That terrorism started after 2001. But there were terrorists in Pakistan, weren't there, throughout the 1990s. In fact, isn't it the case that terrorism was produced in Pakistan as an export commodity? It was not meant for domestic consumption, and they turned their guns on inwardly only after 2001, when the state took them on. Until then, they were enjoying state patronage.
That is not disputable. What is disputable is the number of terror incidents in which civil life has been disrupted or economic life has been talking about what was happening in the country. As far as the country was concerned, it was a peaceful country. All the tourists from all over the world used to come here. The students used to study in Karachi University and Punjab University. It was a very peaceful country.
And yet this country nearly landed up on the State Department's list of countries as state sponsors of terrorism, and the civilian governments had to take the fall for a policy that was being patronized by the military. Isn't that right?
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the comparison between 1990
isn't that a misleading comparison to make?
No, not at all.
Let's move on. As I said, we keep it rapid fire. To what extent, in a country like Pakistan, do the numbers really capture the reality that we need to see in order to be able to understand the capacity of the state to govern its citizens? To what extent do the numbers really capture the full reality? The growth rates, can we just compare the growth rates from the 60s and the 2000s and say, well, one era was better than the other?
Yeah, that's what empirical economists do all over the world. That you make comparisons on one period of time. I have no other way of doing it.
Okay. But would you agree that there is a likelihood that the numbers could be missing more than they are capturing?
That happens everywhere. The numbers in the 60s may be understatement. The number in 2000s may be overstatement. Those discrepancies take place, but as long as they do not alter the underlying mean, I don't care for that.
I'll give you one number that escapes when we look at growth rates. I'm using it as an example. That's the number of children under the age of 5 who are undernourished and thereby suffering from physical stunting in their growth. That number has not changed regardless of when there is growth and when there isn't. In fact, the only time that that number came down was in periods of civilian rule, in the 1990s particularly, and it grew again in the high growth rates of Pervez Musharraf. Did those growth rates leave large numbers of people behind?
No, I think
What
what happened.
of this figure then?
What happened was that malnutrition is an issue of early childhood development. We neglected early childhood development. Everybody did. And we should not apportion the blames on, I'm not defending the military government, I think that is a disaster. But I'm just saying that stunting is a function of the malnutrition, and you create conditions like Bangladesh did, where they provide nutritious food to the school-going children, and you will find that stunting is not a policy intervention.
I'm using stunting as an example.
It is important.
Only as an example to say that are these growth rates really, the benefits of their growth rates really reaching the population?
We now take the multidimensional poverty index, which takes all of these issues into consideration, and make a composite index. You don't take growth rate. For me, growth rate is immaterial. It is the multidimensional poverty index.
But in your presentation just now,
Yeah.
you focused in on growth rates.
Sure, absolutely. But
So
the marginal difference, as far as the prosperity of the people is concerned, that would be much less. As far as this, including stunting is concerned, you may alter the growth rate by maybe 0.5 percentage points.
that's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving. Without spending, we can open it up very soon as well. You said that defense expenditure grows and contracts with the economy. It's not some sort of an independent variable that is continuously growing, and therefore the garrison state hypothesis overstates the case. But to what extent does the formally reported defense expenditures in the budget really capture the full extent of the military's control of the material resources of the state?
And I was chairman of Pay and Pension Commission, so I've looked at the military expenditures in detail. Every single rupee is spent. Every single rupee is audited by the military accountant general. Asking these basis on which I have computed these defense expenditures.
But the defense expenditure include only salaries and by and large salaries, and they don't include, for instance, subsidies being paid to defense establishments.
Which establishments are you subsidizing?
Are defense establishments not benefiting from any kind of subsidy?
No, not at all.
Does Fortune Fertilizer not get that?
Not at all.
On a subsidized basis?
Like Engro, they get the same thing. It's level playing field.
Are they part of the merit order list?
Pardon?
Are they part of the merit order list?
I think the subsidy to Fauji, Fatma, Engro are exactly the same.
If we look at the growth of urban land controlled by the military over the past, let's say, 25 years, just the sheer size of the DHA, 20 years ago, there was one DHA, then there was another in Lahore. Now we have that in one shower in the house,
Yeah.
more and more connect, and of course another one from here.
Yeah.
One figure presented before a report said 47% of Karachi's land is actually controlled.
That's not really true. That's not true. If you take Civil Aviation Authority, Port Qasim, Steel Mill, Cantonment Boards, 33% of the land of Karachi, according to the master plan of 2002, is outside other bodies, which are 16 of them. Now, DHA is taken very much as a whipping horse. I'm a beneficiary from the DHA. I bought a house from a military officer who was given this as the first place. But the capital appreciation I have accumulated over the period is enormous. And I'm a civilian. This guy may have accumulated maybe a 50 lakhs from the price he purchased and the price at which he sold. But I've accumulated over that period of time crores of rupees. So I do not think that development of real estate in an organized manner on a commercial basis is a benefit to any particular segment of the population.
You mentioned when you were talking about good governance that in Pakistan there is a market.
Everywhere it happens. It is the extent to which it happens.
So how can we lay the blame for our peculiar thing
Because
on this?
because in Latin America, you have a peculiar instrument which is called SRO. SRO is the highly discretionary power which is conferred in the hands of your tax authorities, where it says that Ishrat Husain is importing steel and the tariff rate will be 10%. But Khurram Hussain, when he imports the same tariff, the tariff rate will go up to 50%. That is the manipulation through which level playing field is being violated.
Okay, let's keep moving forward. You mentioned the line of indirect taxation. Isn't it the case that many countries rely on indirect taxation?
In the beginning, yes. But as a $1,600 economy, you should have at least 40% of direct taxes. What you have done, you have distorted even direct taxes. 66% of your direct taxes are withholding taxes. These are not collected on the incomes. So I can collect or can pay 15% on my consulting fee, but my total income is 7 times more than the consulting fee. But by paying 15%, I have settled my liability. I should be able to pay 30% of my total income. Cannot pay.
So it's not as far as ungovernability in Pakistan is concerned, these things start to exist in many constitutions such as growing extremist mindset that finds protection from key institutions in this country, civil military divide, where one element in this divide is interfering in the political process and bringing in its favor and engage in other political parties and more. And the third is an informal sector, growing informal sector, undocumented income that has obvious implications for government.
Of course, I talk about informal sector. And I talk about civil military relations. There's a whole chapter on the civil military relations in my book. There is a. There is. That is a fact of life. Nobody can deny that.
Side of that divide.
No, I don't think we should have a harmony among different segments of the population and different institutions. The entire thesis of this is that democratic governance institutions should become so strong that the military becomes back to their quarters and their barracks, and they don't dare interfere in the affairs of this country. It is our fault. In my time, when I was a civil servant, as a deputy commissioner, I would take orders on my own without interference from anybody. Because the office of the deputy commissioner has become so weak that we have to go to rangers in order to establish law and order. I'm not very happy about it. I'm asking for regaining of the supremacy of the civilian institutions like the civil service in order to get this fight in its place.
Do you think mainstreaming extremist and militant groups that are designated as terrorist entities by the UN Security Council is a good way to tackle extremism?
I would very much like to see the evidence as to what these mainstreamings will do. It's too early to speculate. I am not speculating. I'm making a comparison up to 2015. At that time, the mainstreaming was not an issue at all. So I'm just watching the situation. I cannot make any definite judgment whether this is happening or this is not happening and what its repercussions would be. If I have any doubts about it, I'll certainly voice them.
Okay, this is a good time to open it up. We can go on like this for a long time, actually.